Hello, NDC Oslo. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you've been having a great time at the conference so far. My name is Eli, and I'm here today to talk to you about data storage. This is me. That's a photo of me on the boat cruise at NDC Sydney last October. I work as a developer advocate at a company called Scaleway. It's a European cloud provider. And we deal quite a lot with data storage and retrieval, whether that's like code, media, whatever. So I started learning about how and why we store the data the way that we do. And I've gone down like a lot of rabbit holes. And now we're all here today. So what is data storage? Before we get properly started, it's worth thinking about what the actual concept is that I'm going to talk about today. In one of the Sherlock Holmes stories, written Arthur Conan Doyle, it turns out that the titular detective, Sherlock Holmes, doesn't know that the Earth revolves around the sun. And he defends this lack of knowledge by saying that his brain is like an attic, and it's crammed full of knowledge. And in order to store knowledge about the solar system, something that's largely useless to him in his line of work as a detective, he'd have to chuck something else out to make room. Obviously, things aren't quite that straightforward, but the general principle stands. So, for example, how many people in the room know 3 phone numbers by heart? Raise your hand if you know 3 phone numbers. 4? 5? That's quite a lot of people, actually. OK. In the last month, how many people have had to call a phone number that wasn't one of the ones they know by heart? Yeah, we need to know more things than we can remember, right? And so we need to take the things that we know but don't have space for and put them somewhere. To store something, we have to turn it into a physical object. And this talk is about that, how we as a species have done that and continue to do it, and the impacts that computers have had on our solutions to this problem. One thing I'm also going to touch on is the durability of data storage, whether that's to do with the physical medium that we use to store the data, or the encodings that we use, like the process of taking that data and turning it into an object. So, for example, can anybody in this room tell me, without getting out their phone, where this QR code leads? Yeah. Without specialized hardware and software, this stored data is completely inaccessible. The encoding isn't something that humans can do by themselves intuitively. We've seen loss of data due to storage formats becoming inaccessible over time. And there's a concept that people who do archival work have referred to as the digital dark age. And this is the idea that as our data storage becomes increasingly digital, there's very little left that isn't vulnerable to that kind of loss of access when the technology to decode it becomes obsolete. So this talk, I've divided up into 4 sections. The first is we're going to kick off with going way back into history, like the Bronze Age. How did people store information before computers? Then I'm going to talk about old computing stuff, obsolete electronic methods, like magnetic drum memory used by IBM, core rope memory knitted by little old ladies that powered the Apollo missions, like some really cool, weird stuff. Then I'm going to talk about current electronic methods that we have and how they work, stuff you're going to be familiar with, hard drives, modern magnetic tape storage, flash storage. And finally, just for fun, I'm going to talk about what the future might hold for data storage and get a bit weird and sci-fi with it. So, let's get going. Old stuff that has survived the test of time. This is a clay tablet from 1750 BCE. These were traditionally not fired in a kiln. They were actually just air-dried. And as a result, we don't have a lot of them left. The ones we do have, the one that is pictured up here, we have it because a guy's house burned down. And the fire fired the clay tablets that were in there and made them more durable over time, and so we still have them today. As a result, we actually know about the guy whose house burned down. It turns out this is a customer complaint about some crappy copper that he sold. We know about this guy called Nazir, who lived in ancient Mesopotamia, and this is the oldest written customer complaint. This tablet is written in Akkadian cuneiform, and that writing system was actually lost for a long, long time. Linguists in the 18th and 19th century spent a lot of time figuring out how to decipher it. So while the physical object is very durable, although accidentally, the encoding of the data on it was actually fragile and lost for a long time. On the other end of physical durability, we've got pen and paper kind of storage, ink and parchment, pigments on papyrus, that sort of thing. Again, the encoding is written language, so you'd have to be able to understand that language in order to get the information back out of the object. This photo is of the first 2 pages of the Beowulf manuscript, which was produced sometime between 975 and 1025 Common Era. We don't know when the poem itself was originally composed, and this is the only copy we have of it. Really, really influential text in the study of the English language and Old English. This manuscript was formed part of a library called the Cotton Library, and it's named after a guy called Cotton, who had a fondness for old and weird things, a bit like me. And for a time, this library was stored in this building called Ashburnham House. Does anybody want to guess what happened to Ashburnham House? Yeah, it caught fire. Nominative determinism at its best. Unlike clay tablets, fire is bad for paper, it turns out. And a lot of the library was either damaged or completely lost as a result. The Beowulf manuscript suffered a bit of scorching around the edges, and it's continued to accrue damage over time. And that's why you see in the last slide, it's actually been put onto much sturdier paper in order to keep it safe. Right, this is all very interesting, right? But you may be thinking, this is meant to be a tech talk. What does any of this have to do with technology? And now I get to tell you one of my favorite facts. The English word technology comes from the same Proto-Indo-European root as the word for textiles. Historically, this makes a lot of sense, actually, because textiles for a long time were like the site of technological innovation. Things humans needed to do in order to survive were like grow enough food and make enough cloth to wear and use for things like bedding and sails for ships. If you spend any time looking at like illuminated manuscripts or medieval art, you'll see a lot of women with drop spindles. That's what this woman has here, and she's also got a little cat playing with the yarn, which touches my heart as somebody whose cat tries to eat their knitting constantly. You'll see women with drop spindles in a lot of medieval art and illuminated manuscripts. Because if you were a woman in, let's say, the 1200s, 1300s, and you had 5 spare minutes, no, you didn't. You had 5 more minutes to be spinning yarn. Incidentally, we get the English idiom, spinning a yarn, to mean telling a story, like telling a tall tale, because women would sit together and spin wool fibers into yarn and tell each other stories, the original book clubs. In the 2nd century, China, people invented the draw loom, and you can see one here. And that's a machine for weaving thread into fabric. This helped fabric production enormously. The way that it works is you have threads that run up and down. Those are called warp threads. And some that go back and forth, and those are called the weft threads. Each time you want to make the weaving motion, weaving the back and forth ones through the up and down ones, you have to select some of the up and down ones to go forward, and some of the ones to come back, and then you pass the weft in the gap that's made in the middle. Now, people need fabric, and they'll make do with boring plain fabric, but what they really like is fancy patterned fabric. And you can make that with this draw loom. You can see there's some lovely stripes going on in that one. But it's pretty labor intensive because the way that it's created, fancy patterns, is when you're choosing which threads go forward and which ones come back, you choose them very strategically to create patterns out of the different colors of thread. And this is just really labor intensive. It was very error prone. There was a job called a draw boy where you'd have child labor and a little boy would go and select each thread and it was just really, really time and labor intensive. If only we could, turn that pattern data into a physical object that the machine could use and do this automatically. And this is where we get punch cards. How this works is as follows. For each of those threads that you have to select each time, there's a little hook that can come up and grab the thread. And if there's a hole in the punch card at that point, the hook can come through. And if there's not a hole, then the hook gets stopped. And so you can automate the process of choosing the warp threads. And this makes it much, much easier to make fancy fabric. People like that. This is some fabric woven with a punch card operated loom. The ideas behind this were developed by a few different artisans and inventors from France in the 1700s, and it ended up with a guy called Joseph-Marie Jacquard. He patented a machine that could be added to regular draw looms and to give them this functionality. And those are called Jacquard machines. The patents from punch cards made in the 1700s are still in use today. So that's a big win for data durability there. Punch cards went on to be instrumental in the history of computing, as I'm sure a lot of you know. And we will talk about that in a moment. Next thing I want to talk about is vinyl audio records. Does anyone here listen to vinyl, have a record player? Yep. It's really cool. The reason that they're actually, I've sort of pulled them out specifically here is because they're the first example of a really common paradigm of data storage that we're going to see again and again over the next 40, 50 minutes. You have a spinning disk, and you have data that's recorded on that disk either in a spiral or in concentric circles, and then you have a head that reads data off that spinning disk. In vinyl disks, that's that they have a single spiral track running outwards, and the data is encoded in analog sort of variations on the surface of the disk. And the head is just the little needle that sort of spins, sort of goes up and down as the disk spins, and turns that texture into an electrical signal. Record players then take that signal and turn it into audio. That's a nice up-close photo of a vinyl disc. Because the data is encoded in the texture of the disk, and it doesn't have like a protective case, other than, you've got your sleeve, obviously, but in order to play it, it needs to be unprotected. You have to be really, really careful when handling them, as anybody who actually listens to them is very well aware. We actually get the phrase like a broken record, meaning repetitive, because scratches on the disk can cause the needle on the head to skip backwards to an earlier section and play the same bit of audio over and over again. So physically, these disks are pretty fragile. The encoding itself of the data onto the physical hardware can be compromised by common things like dust and grease from fingerprints and scratches. So that brings us up to the wonderful world of electricity, magnetism, and computers. We've got punch cards again. Punch cards round 2. In 1890, a guy called Herman Hollerith developed machines for tabulating census data for the US 1890 census. All that data was stored on punch cards. He later founded a company which got merged with a few others, eventually becoming the corporation we all know and love today as IBM. The concept here is the same as with the loom. A gap in the card allows a connection to be made. In the case of Hollerith's original tabulating machines, the connection was electrical. You had a little spring that dipped down and connected into a pool of mercury, because that's great and safe and very chemically, great for humans to be around. Something you might notice is this punch card has 80 characters per line, 80 columns. This is where we get the widespread convention today of 80 characters per line. Early computer terminals just picked this up and ran with it, and there are non-technological reasons for keeping that convention today, but this is where it originated. So punch cards for data, output, and tabulation were eventually superseded by magnetic storage of various kinds, which is what we're going to talk about next. This is some drum memory. This is Sweden's first binary computer. It's called the BESK system, and now we are cooking with magnets. Magnetic storage works like this. You have some surface, like ferromagnetic material, that's like iron, cobalt, or nickel, and it's arranged in a certain crystalline structure, and you can manipulate the magnetic polarity of that surface one way or the other to represent a 1 or a 0. So you can store data on this magnetic surface as binary. Drum memory works by having a drum, like a cylinder, coated in this surface, and then around the drum in circles, you would store data on tracks, and so you'd have multiple tracks on the drum. And the heads, you can have multiple heads on a single drum, or you could have just one. If you had just one, it would have to move up and down to the correct track before reading memory, and that took time. That's a process called seeking. And if you had lots and lots of heads, you'd be able to read data from any of the tracks at any given point, but it was much more expensive to manufacture. That gave you much, much faster memory access, which you really cared about if you were using this as the working memory of your computer, which was the primary usage. There were some places like IBM, and I think the Swedish BESK computer used it as secondary memory storage, so not the working memory. But primarily they were used for what we use RAM for today. They were eventually superseded by magnetic cores for that purpose, and for secondary storage they were superseded by the hard disk drives. So, magnetic cores, the things that replace drum memory as working memory from computers. I'm assuming lots of people have seen images like this before. It's a really cool. It was the primary memory store for computers between about 1950 and 1970. Dominant form of random access memory, and it was so ubiquitous that it was often just referred to as core memory or just core. So you have all these rings of magnetic material, and they represent bits. And then you have at least 2 wires running through each one. And their state can be manipulated by those wires. When you pass current through those wires, they induce magnetic hysteresis in these little donuts and magnetize them one way or the other, again representing a 1 or a 0. The cores retain their magnetization even when there isn't current running. So unlike RAM, this is non-volatile. When there's no current, the state is actually still retained. So they remember their state, and that makes them, it's non-volatile. However, reading from a core will reset its value to 0, so it's called destructive readout. Once you've read from this, the data is no longer there anymore. One neat fact about this kind of memory is it was heated, not cooled, to make it work best. The requirement for it is actually that it just had a consistent temperature, not necessarily a cool one, and it's a lot easier to heat things up than it is to cool them down. So if your PC ever gets too hot, maybe consider installing some magnetic core memory to take advantage of that for a little bit of a retro feel for your PC. Using smaller and smaller cores and wires allowed the memory to become much more dense, store more data in the same space, until manufacturing it became so labor-intensive as a process done by hand that it was eventually superseded by RAM, which we use today. Thinking about threading lots and lots of wires through cores, this is one of my favorite things in the entire talk. This is a piece of software. This is core rope memory, and it was a form of read-only memory for computers, where the process of writing to this is actually also the process of manufacture. The topology of the wires through the cores encodes data, and to update this software, you've got to do all sorts of complicated threading and unthreading, and this type of memory got the name of little old lady memory, because a lot of the people who manufactured it were women doing what looked very much like threadcraft. The most famous usage of this kind of memory was in the Apollo missions, and Margaret Hamilton was the head of the team responsible for the maintenance and development of the memory for that computer. It's the physical save button. I've had 13 people make that joke to me over the full course of the last 2 days. Floppy disks. I feel really old putting these in the past section. Seen here in 8-inch, 5.25 inch, and 3.5 inches. These bad boys were the latest and greatest in removable media storage from about the mid-1970s to the early 2000s. Hands up if anyone in this room has never used a floppy disk. Okay, we're good. In like 5 more years, we might not be good. They're called floppy disks because of the actual media that they use to store data, and it's that spinning disk paradigm again. You have a disk of magnetic data, and you store data on it by magnetizing the surface, and that's ones and zeros. So here's a naked one. You can see what the actual disk looks like. This is the innards of a 3.5-inch floppy disk. If you pick that up and shook it, it'll go boop, 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 boop. Closer up, it looks like this. This was a photo taken with a magnetic field camera, and the bright and dark parts represent the polarity on the surface, which is the ones and zeros. One interesting thing about floppy disks, and this is also true of vinyl, is they spin with a constant angular velocity. It's always spinning around at the same rate. And data on the disk was commonly addressed by sectors, and sectors of a disk are like pizza slices. So you divide up the disk radially, and then within those sectors it was addressed by track, the concentric rings out from the center. So here we've got a representation of 2 tracks within a sector. And within each sector, for each bit of track, you store the same number of bytes because you spend the same time spinning through it, whether you're closer to the center or closer to the edge. And sort of abstract representation is it looks a bit like this. And you can see that at the edges, it's way more spread out. At the center, it's way more compressed. So at the edges, you're not actually efficiently using the medium. You're not storing data as densely as you could possibly be. Apple experimented with this, with fixing this, by developing a floppy disk protocol, essentially, that spun the disk more slowly when data was being read or written to the edges. But it required proprietary circuitry and proprietary software, and the disks written with this method weren't readable by drives made by other manufacturers, and it was very expensive, and they basically gave up and went back to constant angular velocity floppy disks. Before computing environments were regularly networked, like before we had the internet or even other networking methods, floppy disks were like the go-to way of transferring data between machines. And of course, this legacy lives on with floppy disks having become the global symbol for a save button. But all good things come to an end, and eventually other data storage formats became more competitive in terms of speed, cost of manufacture, and density of storage. In February 2003, Dell announced that they would no longer pre-install floppy disk drives on one of their flagship home computers, although it was still available upon request. And by 2007, only 2% of computers sold in stores had built-in floppy drives. This is from 2019. If you ever worry that the technology that you love best is like going to get old and get superseded by AI or WASM containers or any of the newfangled things that we're inflicting upon ourselves, don't sweat it. Somewhere in the world, there will be a government who's going to use your chosen technology for decades. And floppy disks aren't quite dead yet. They're still only mostly dead. I went on Amazon and I looked up floppy disk to USB drives, and you can still get them. They're still pretty widely available. I couldn't get one with a USB-C connector, only USB-A, so I don't think they're going to survive the jump to like all of us only having USB-C ports ever. But if I wanted to read a floppy disk from my MacBook, I could. In theory, I could. Wikipedia calls this technology obsolescent, which I think is just incredible, an incredible word. So that brings us up to the current day. Now I'm going to be talking about stuff that we actually use. Optical drives. I kind of debated putting these in the past section because, does anyone have a PC that has an optical drive at the moment? That's more than I thought. Yeah, cool. Yeah, we're keeping it alive. Does anyone have a game console that has an optical drive in it? Yeah, that's right. The Blu-ray business is booming, and the PS5 and the Xbox still have optical disc drives. So they are definitely still around. So I'm grouping a bunch of different technologies here under the heading of optical drives. So this is like laser discs, CD-ROMs, writable CDs, Blu-rays, DVDs. They all use the same paradigm. They've got, once again, it's a spinning disc. They spin around, something reads data off of it. On optical discs, the data is encoded with bumps and dips on a polycarbonate layer. That's at the sort of the center of the disc. And that means data, if you've got lots of disks that you want to represent the same data, you can actually produce them, you can manufacture them mechanically by like stamping that surface, that texture onto the polycarbonate. Then, on top of that polycarbonate layer, you've got some kind of reflective material, which is aluminium, usually in read-only disks, and then like a layer of lacquer on the top to kind of protect that encoding. In this case, the instrument that reads the data out in an optical disk drive is a laser diode paired with a laser detector. And what it's detecting in this case is the reflectivity of the surface of the CD. We've got the innards of a CD drive here. This is, I believe it's specifically a CD drive from an Acer laptop. CD-ROMs, which is ROM for read-only memory, like the core wrote memory, those were developed by Sony in 1984. And it wasn't until 1997 that we got ones that we could write to ourselves at home. This is one of those. One thing you might notice is that it has a much darker surface than the one I just showed. This is because the layer of metal that sits in between the polycarbonate and the lacquer is actually it's not made of aluminium, it's made of a silver indium antimony tellurium alloy, try saying that 3 times fast. What that does is it allows the laser, the same laser that your drive could use to read, it allows it to actually melt that layer and turn it from a crystalline structure into a sort of amorphous liquidy structure. And what that does is reduce its reflectivity. It basically turns that bit on the disk, the bit it represents, turns it from a 1 into a 0. And this causes it to be read in the same way as a bump would be, or either a bump or a dip, doesn't really matter. You can write to this disk now, but you're not changing the underlying polycarbonate structure, you're changing what the metal within it actually looks like. And in order to revert that amorphous metal that you melted back to its crystalline state, you have to heat up the whole disk at once, up to about 200 degrees Celsius. And that's why when you burn a CD, you can't you can't do random write. You have to write all at once. And if you want to erase, you have to erase it all at once. So reading out of data out of an optical disk requires its surface to be legible to the thing that's reading out of it. Unlike floppy disks, they don't have protective housing by default. You store them in like a jewel case. But when you're actually handling them, like vinyl, you'll get fingerprints all over them. They'll get scratched. I think it's safe to say a lot of us have probably experienced this at some point in our lives. You can also straight up break them. This is a still from a video of the slow-mo guys back in 2015 spinning a CD until it just exploded. It just goes in real time. It just goes. And they recorded it at 170,000 frames per second with what was state-of-the-art slow-mo camera recording software back in a slow-mo camera back in the day. And I've never broken a CD quite this dramatically. But unlike analog data formats, this is unrecoverable. I cannot get the data back out of this if this happens to it. Unlike, let's say I tear up a piece of paper. I could probably piece it back together and get that information back out of it. And that's not true of a CD, it's not true of vinyl. So, and it's not true of any other of the formats that we use for digital data storage today. Next up, cassette tapes, more generally, magnetic tapes. Here we have an example of a data storage medium that's not random access. So with floppy disks and CDs, you can move the read head to any point on the disk and read from an arbitrary bit of the disk. That's not true with cassette tapes. You had to rewind to get to the song you liked. You rented The Lord of the Rings from Blockbuster or whatever, and after you were done with it, you had to scroll it all the way back to the beginning. So they store data sequentially, and that means that they do not have linear random access time. Tapes are made of ferromagnetic material, again, and now we all know by now how the data was encoded. You magnetize the material, ones and zeros, positive and negative polarity. The hardware that reads and writes to this kind of storage is called a tape drive. These are some of the first magnetic tapes used to record computer data. In 1951 for the UNIVAC 1, IBM quickly followed suit after this and set standards for the industry recording on magnetic tapes. And they've been in pretty constant use ever since, despite their drawback of having non-linear random access. They're very durable, magnetism-wise. It doesn't degrade over time. They're quite cheap to manufacture, and they're removable from their surrounding hardware, which means that you can just take it out and put it in an air-gapped place. It's not vulnerable to any vulnerabilities that the surrounding hardware has, computational attacks. If a hacker gets into your network, they can't compromise the data that's on your magnetic tape drive. It's literally not physically connected. However, if you've got data that's just on a magnetic tape in a data center that's just sitting in a room somewhere, it's going to take a while for you to be able to access that data. Somebody needs to go physically pick up the thing, put it in a computer, let the computer read it. So today they're largely used for cold storage of data, data that's only ever really rarely accessed, because that makes the slow access times a reasonable constraint. I talked earlier about the digital dark age, and this is one of the most famous examples of it actually happening. This is a replica of the 1976 Viking Mars lander with Carl Sagan next to it. And in 1976, NASA put one of these on Mars. And it recorded a bunch of data to magnetic tapes. NASA got the tapes back and left them in the cupboard for 10 years. And when they got around to trying to read them, they couldn't, because all of the original programmers had either left NASA or died, and they didn't write down how the data format used. It took months for current engineers, or current at the time engineers, to reconstruct the data format, and it involved actually going and looking at the physical hardware used to record that magnetic data to reverse engineer how it even worked. And it's incredibly lucky that they were able to get that data back. The original tapes of the moon landing probably were overwritten and erased, and we don't have those originals anymore. All we have are copies. Right, more spinning disks, if you can believe it. Hard drive disks, we always use them, love them. You get them built into most personal computers now, unless you're a solid-state only enjoyer. And you can get external ones that you can fill up with loads of pirated media. I checked the other day, and looks like 20 terabytes is available commercially. That'll hold a lot of movies. Wikipedia says that 26 terabytes was available commercially last year, but I couldn't find one. So these work using the same paradigm as floppy disks, optical media. Thing spin round, thing reads off it. The medium is, again, magnetic storage, so don't put your electromagnets too close to these. Once again, it was IBM who pioneered the usage of these, with the first one coming out in 1957, storing a whopping 3.7 megabytes of data. In the photo here, you can see two of them. Those are the big cabinet things. Those are hard drives. They had 52 disks each, one arm holding two read-write heads. IBM kept iterating and improving on the hardware, and they briefly flirted with a model that had one read-write head per track, which gave you no seek time, basically. It's called the IBM 2305. These turned out to be incredibly expensive, and they were discontinued. Over the 1980s, hard drive disks went from being sort of like a very expensive, early adopter type add-on to being just standard issue. Get them in every computer. We have a close-up photo of one here. Modern hard drives have actually got to the stage where the areas of the disks being magnetized are so small that they risk losing their state due to an effect known as super paramagnetism, whereby heat can cause magnetized areas to just randomly flip their polarity in areas smaller than 50 nanometers. For reference, the thickness of a piece of like regular copy paper is anywhere between 70,000 and 180,000 nanometers. We're talking like tiny here. We've got so advanced with our hardware storage on hard disk drives that we're bumping up against like fundamental limits of what the universe will let us do with magnets. That's pretty damn cool. To counter this, modern disks actually have 2 layers of magnetic materials, polarized oppositely, and that has a reinforcing effect. They sort of attract to each other and keep reinforcing each other. So we've sort of like got a little workaround for that fundamental limit of the universe, which I think is just deeply, deeply cool. So this is a data bunker, 25 meters underneath Paris, which is actually fairly close to the range where the catacombs are. I don't know if it's near them. I don't know if you know sort of how close the skeletons and the ossuaries are or anything. And this is where Scaleway, that's my employer, hey, they pay me to do this. This is where we keep our glacier storage, which is cold storage, if you can believe it. One of the things that got me writing this talk was learning that this is actually hard drive storage and not magnetic tapes, which is what I had originally assumed. Hard drives in this bunker, actually, they operate differently than most commercially available hard drives. Most commercially available hard drives use a writing method called parallel magnetic recording, where the trade-off there is basically really easy read-write, really fast to write, but you have slightly less efficient data density storage of data on the disk. You're not packing as much data in as you possibly could. The ones in this bunker use a method called shingled magnetic recording, and the trade-off there is that you've got much, much denser data storage, but writing to them is an absolute pain. And this makes them really useful for cold storage, because you rarely are writing to it, you're usually reading from it, and even then, only infrequently. And I just thought that was really cool. It's like, oh, I just assumed it was magnetic tapes, but it turns out we're doing something deeply cursed with hard drives instead. That's cool. So, last but not least, flash memory. You've got some of this in your pocket, probably. It's in smartphones, it's in tablets. If you've got a YubiKey or a 2FA token, then that's got some flash in it too. They work by using a circuit component called a floating gate MOSFET, which is it's extremely complicated. I tried to figure out how to explain this talk, and I just gave up. I was like, no, I'm too stupid for this. Essentially, it's able to store electrical charge, and the drive will draw power from whatever it's interacting with, whatever computer it's interacting with, whether that's over USB or integrated directly into a circuit board. And for removable devices, this is great because they don't require an external power source, unlike external hard drives these days. You just plug and go. They do have a few limitations or drawbacks, though. For a given block of storage on a flash drive, and this is true for SSDs as well, you can only really write to it all at once, not in patches. This is because of the way that the MOSFETs actually work. You can overwrite sequentially in very specific circumstances, but it's much, much easier to just say, no, you have to write to the entire block at once. They also have a lifetime limit on how often they can be written to, because the electronic components essentially end up with like wear from having charge put in and out of them over time. So to mitigate this, flash drives include something called a memory controller, which sort of spreads the load over time over different blocks of storage and does this thing called wear leveling, so that all of the blocks of memory in your flash drive will degrade ideally at the same rate until it all just goes. Finally, those MOSFETs, those tiny little, very, very complicated electronic components, they actually leak charge over time. If you have a USB somewhere that you haven't touched for 10 years, you've left it in a drawer like NASA did with the magnetic tapes from the Viking lander, you will be able to plug it into USB-A port today, but your data might be a little garbled. So they're not durable over long time periods, unlike magnetic tape storage or hard drives. So SSDs, in particular, will not store data over a long period of time if you just leave them in a drawer, put it on a hard drive. So we've learned all about the history and the current state of data storage. We know a bit more about how and why the various types are used for various purposes. Now, all of the current methods of storage that we've just talked about are probably going to get incrementally better and better over time. We'll improve the lifetime wear of flash memory. We'll probably be able to get bigger and better hard drives. None of that is like cool and sexy, though. That's not like interesting and futuristic. Let's talk about some stuff that is. I make no promises that any of this will actually ever be used in the future, but it's cool. DNA. DNA is really, really, really data dense. Microscopically small cells encode the entire data for the entire genetic code for an entire species. a team at the Los Alamos National Laboratory has created an encoding for turning binary into DNA base pairs, A, C, T, and G bases. There are a few other encodings with various pros and cons, like better error detection or better data density. There's not really a consensus on the best way to do this. It's going to depend on exactly what you're using it for. The idea is that you create synthetic DNA representing your data, and DNA can be stored durably, very easily, just at low temperatures for decades. We can do this today. People are doing this today. It's just not very efficient in terms of like read-write time, if you can believe that. There's DNA data on the moon, courtesy of the Bereshit lander in April 2019. It did crash, so like there's a good chance that that data is just lost and like scattered across the surface of the moon. But if it isn't, then the foundation that built and sent that lander say that it could still be legible in billions of years, like billions. Like rotate that in your mind for a moment. That's crazy. That's crazy. When I was researching this originally, thought that the idea was that you'd be able to create DNA that would also self-replicate and like encode DNA into like plants, and you grow up and you have these freaky plants that also have like Linux on them or something. I don't know. We've already inflicted so much pain on the world. Why would we do this? But I don't know if that's actually a thing or if that's just a sci-fi idea that was living in my head. I could not find evidence that people are doing this. But one thing that DNA is also quite good at is replicating itself with pretty low error rates. So if we ever did want to do, sort of keep a certain piece of data alive forever, just put it in like some dandelion DNA and send it out into the world or something. Yeah, maybe in the future we'll all become like human DNA cyborgs, I don't know, running Elon Musk's OS or something. I really hope not. Next up is 5D optical data storage. A big shout out to Chris Ayers for telling me about this, so I could put it in the talk. This is sometimes called Superman storage, named after the Kryptonian memory crystals in the DC universe. The 5D optical data storage is a bit of a marketing play. It doesn't have actually what we would think of as 5 dimensions. What it is you take a transparent, non-photosensitive material, something like fused quartz or a bit of really toughened glass, and then you use a laser that fires really, really short, like femtosecond laser pulses into it to engrave into it. And you can use this to store data. So the 5 dimensions, quote unquote, obviously you have the 3 spatial dimensions of a piece of glass, and then you've got 2 extra degrees of freedom. They're not dimensions, they're degrees of freedom, and that is what angle you're looking at it from and how closely you're looking at it, because the way that you read out of this is with just a microscope, essentially, an optical microscope. And the image here is the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Both Hitachi and Microsoft have worked on this concept. The current bleeding edge stuff with this kind of data storage is currently being developed by a team at Southampton University in the UK. And all of the teams that are working on this are doing so with the explicit aim of data durability over time. This data isn't going anywhere. It's not going to dissipate. There's no electrical charge to leak away into the ether. You can drop the glass and break it. I think that would be a very, very expensive mistake if you did do that. And the encoding used to turn data into this engraving isn't yet settled as far as I can tell. We don't have like a consensus. So until that's happened, then maybe in the future nobody will be able to decode this because they won't know how. But if that is settled, then this could be a really, really cool way of and it's incredibly data dense as well, right? This is pretty tiny, this glass that's in this photo, I think, and it's all of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. But I don't know how it's encoded in there. It might just be like 7-bit ASCII, I don't know. But if we still know how to decode that in like 1,000 years, then we have this piece of glass and we'll be able to retrieve it, which I think is really, really cool. Right, finally, this is one of my favorite bits of the talk. Time crystals. Who has heard of time crystals? Are you a condensed matter physicist by chance? I'm so sorry for what I'm about to do to your beautiful profession. Yeah, this isn't a time crystal. This is a space crystal. You've got this in your pockets. This is silicon. The thing that makes it a space crystal is that it has a recurring structure in space. You've got your atoms arranged like this, and then 1 unit over, you have them exactly like that again. So the structure recurring in space is what makes this a space crystal. That's what a crystal is, recurring structure. So time crystals are the same, but they have a repeating structure in time. And there aren't good photos of time crystals. We have made them, they do exist. There aren't good photos of them. This GIF kind of gets the idea across, I think. A time crystal is an object where its lowest energy state, its resting state, is actually one of motion, not a stationary one. This doesn't break the conservation of energy because something quantum physics. I did read the Wikipedia page, and for about 5 seconds I had an out-of-body experience and actually understood it, and then I lost that. So, they were first theorized to exist in 2012 by a theoretical physicist called Frank Wilczek, and in 2021, a team of scientists at the University of Hamburg made one in a lab. It didn't look like this. It didn't look like what you'd think of as a crystal. It's a Bose-Einstein condensate, which is a state of matter that you can get when you supercool boson gases. I know I personally hate it when I open my freezer, and I've just made a Bose-Einstein condensate, again, by accident. But the reason they're in this talk, the reason I've shoehorned them into this talk, other than I think they're deeply, deeply cool, is because some very clever people who work in quantum computing think we might be able to use them as some kind of memory store for quantum computers. And as far as I understand it, that's still an open problem. And it's one of the big open problems that we have with quantum computers, that it's really hard to store, have working memory for them, and that it's stable. A fun fact about quantum theory, though, is there is a theorem within it that is called the cloning theorem. And that states that you can never duplicate quantum state, which is the data that we're working with here. You can only ever transfer it. So even if we do manage to develop working memory for quantum computers, it's going to be destructive readout, just like the magnetic core memory back in the 1950s. Time is a flat circle. If we've got some time, do people want me to go on more about time crystals? Because I've pretty much got to the end of the talk. Okay. So time crystals, basically, there's this idea of symmetry in the universe where it's one of the things that makes the conservation of energy work. For the same, if you translate something in time, it can't just gain energy out of nowhere. It's symmetrical. The same amount of energy must exist within a system, a closed system, across time. And there are various other kinds of symmetries. I'm really garbling this because I didn't plan to talk about this. But there's various kinds of time symmetries that these break, and I'm not quite sure how that isn't a violation of the laws of physics. But one of the things that the really interesting kinds of these are something time symmetry breaking crystals. Discrete time symmetry breaking crystals, condensed matter physicist? Yeah, the discrete ones that require lasers. So there are certain type of these that the way that you keep them working is you periodically fire a laser at them, and they don't absorb any energy from the laser, but for some reason that allows them to keep doing their thing of being in their low energy resting state of motion. And the way that I try to understand this is when you have physical crystals, let's say salt crystals forming, sometimes they'll need a nucleation site, a structure in space to start building around. And I think that what those lasers are doing is creating a structure in time for that crystal to kind of form around. This is my very layperson's understanding of it, but I just thought it's really, really cool. The Wikipedia page for time crystals is such a trip. I fully encourage people to go and read it just to have a good time. And if I could have made stickers of them, I would. But I could not find a photo of a Bose-Einstein condensate. Should have snapped a photo when last time I accidentally made one in my freezer. That is pretty much the end of this. We've learned about storing data, all the way customer complaints from the Bronze Age, all the way to encoding data in our DNA and becoming cyborgs. It's been an incomplete and whistle-stop tour. I didn't talk about bubble memory. I didn't talk about mercury relay tubes, but they're kind of volatile, so I'm going to say that I'm going to defend that position. Most of what I wanted to impart is that humans are really cool and creative, and we've been very, very good at making increasingly complicated hardware. But if there is another takeaway from this talk, it's that data is useless if you can't read it. When we make decisions about how and where we store our data, it has to be with durability in mind, which is one of the things I find so exciting about that 5D optical data storage. If we store data, we should probably try and make sure that other people know how to read it in the future. Maybe the Viking 1976 Viking crew who designed that data format should have written it down somewhere and saved their future colleagues a lot of problems. But I guess they didn't expect NASA to just leave their work in a cupboard for 10 years. So But you have to bear in mind, all of this is useless unless another human, which may be your future self, can figure out how to use it. At the end of the day, the reason that we store data is to get around the very human problem that it won't just all fit in our head. That wraps things up for me. That QR code is not a Rickroll. It is a link to a little feedback form where you can anonymously leave me feedback. I really value it. We've got like 15 minutes for question and answers if people want to. I also have some stickers up at the front. I've got some clay tablets and some floppy disks. But yeah, that wraps me up. I really didn't think this was going to come in under an hour, and it's been so short. So yeah, Q&A if you want it. Hello, yes.
Hi. Can we please have 1 more hour of this?
I had to cut so much cool stuff. So there's all these things about Nasir and his the trip that he took to go to this other city and try and get his shitty copper back. And there's so much cool stuff. I really recommend that you go if there's anything that's interested you in this talk. There's probably so much more to learn about it. I had to cut a bunch of stuff. What was some other stuff that I cut? Oh, the way that spindle magnetic recording works. Does anyone want to hear about that? It's not actually that interesting, so you can go look it up if you want to. I tried to put it in this talk, and then I ran this talk for my housemates, and they were like, you need diagrams if you're going to explain this, and it's like, I'm not making diagrams. There's no good diagrams on the internet, so it must be impossible to make them, and I'm not going to try. Yes, thank you very much. That's very flattering. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Any more questions? Anyone got any weird facts they'd like to share? Anything they think I should put in the talk for next time?
Wax cylinders.
Oh, wax cylinders.
Yeah, it's for storing music. It's kind of like vinyl, but...
Ah, cool. Yeah, I debated putting in piano roll for self-playing pianos as well. It's the concept's very similar to a punch card. I don't actually know a lot about wax cylinders. I should look that up. Oh, yeah, I don't like Edison. I don't like him. He had some good ideas, I'll grant him that, but he stole a lot of them from other people, so. Yeah, no, there's a lot of other things that have taken some of these paradigms and used them in niche ways that are really interesting. Yeah, definitely. Wax cylinders, I'll look that up.
If you really want to see a cool video, you know the first IBM PC?
The first IBM PC? Mm-hmm.
Actually had a cassette interface.
I had a cassette interface.
On YouTube, you can find the guy that actually pressed a vinyl record to boot his IBM PC.
Oh, amazing! Somebody booted.
But he boot the program in BASIC from a vinyl record.
Amazing! Yeah, I could boot a program from a vinyl record.
Because it's like, why? Why not?
Yeah, well, because we can.
Do you know about the BBC Doomsday Book project?
Yes, that was one of the other examples of digital dark age stuff. So in England, we have this thing called the Domesday Book, or Doomsday Book, which is in 900 AD, or 900 BCE. No, CE, 900 CE. 1,000 years ago, not 3,000 years ago. There was a census taken, essentially, and there's loads of demographic data that we have from 900 CE. And 900 years later, when was it? Yeah.
1980s, basically?
Yeah, it was 1980s. They sort of did this project where where are we now, 1,000 years later, essentially. And the data was stored on magnetic tapes, I believe.
On laser discs.
Oh, on laser discs. Yes, I knew there was a reason I was going to talk about laser discs, and I only just name dropped them. Yeah, they stored them on laser discs, and people realized that they were probably going to become obsolete, and they were like, we need to transfer this data, because there's a chance that this data could hang around for less time than the one that was written 1,000 years ago.
They ran out of players. So what happened was basically all the libraries were given them, and the school kids contributed basically towards the discs, so that basically there was all these records on it.
Mm-hmm.
But over time, people kind of lost interest, and libraries effectively, binned the kit or whatever.
Yeah.
But they still had quite a few of these discs, but they had nowhere playing it. So they had to basically, there was a project basically, which was done so they could read the information off these old laser discs.
Mm-hmm.
And the project to basically build a device capable of reading the original laser discs cost more than the whole original project.
Oh my gosh. So did anybody not hear that? Should I repeat that for folks at the back? Yeah, so the way that the sort of recent census, I guess, was done was like they got loads of school children in libraries and things to contribute to like write these data to laser discs. And obviously over time interest waned and the libraries sort of chucked away the recording equipment and the equipment to read and write to these laser discs, and they just had these laser discs lying around. And the process of rediscovering the technology to read and write laser discs cost more than the whole original project. Like they spent more fixing the mistake of the digital dark age than they actually spent on gathering that data in the first place. Which, it's genuinely like a real thing that is worth thinking about and being concerned about. And it's why, again, people who are thinking about data durability and designing new data storage formats, I think is really, really very, very, very cool. Yeah, especially ones that don't necessarily require electricity in the future, which is also, got the energy descent that we're likely to have to go into. So not to get too grim at the end of this talk or anything. Anybody else? Okay, I saw you first.
How about telesticks?
Telesticks. I don't know what those are. I'm going to have to go away and look that up.
1,000 years ago, me and you made a deal. Took this piece of wood, carved some notches in it.
Uh-huh.
To help us remember how many bags of whatever we were exchanging.
Oh, okay. So like physical records of sort of transaction.
And then because it's a physical piece of wood,
Mm-hmm.
it showed that we agreed on this and nobody else. You split it down the middle.
Oh, I love that.
Two pieces of a stick that fit together that both line up with the notches, and you can actually check it later.
Like those little necklaces with 1/2 of a heart each. Yeah. So you had a stick that you put notches in to represent an agreement between two people. You split it down the middle. You each take away a half, and they fit together perfectly. So you know that they're two halves of a whole.
Yeah.
That's so cool. I didn't know that. Thank you so much.
And then you can check it. Have they tried to fix the agreement later?
Oh, yeah. Have they tried to tamper with the data afterwards? Yeah, because obviously you could add more notches, but you couldn't fill them in. So whoever's got the least notches has got to be the most authoritative.
Yep.
That's super cool. There was a question or comment. I love them all.
Just another one is a bit related to that. Usually in the old times you have everything you recorded was about transactions.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we cared about. So we have one that we use the knots, side knots.
So the reason I didn't include these, Kifu. I've hidden the slides. Kifu, the Mesoamerican knotted ropes. I went on such a deep dive learning about these things. So storing knotted rope to represent transactional numerical data. And we've lost the encodings for these. We have some extant examples, but we don't quite know what they were meant to represent. I cut them largely for time, and I shouldn't have, as it turns out. One thing I thought was really, really cool about the Kifu is there's one in, I forget exactly where it is, but there was a rebellion against the Spanish somewhere in South America in the early 1800s, I think. And the people, the resistance there, used these knotted ropes to transmit rebellion resistance information in a way that the colonizers couldn't understand. And one thing I think was really, really cool about this, it's basically encoding narrative data. I don't think it technically counts as writing, it's more like proto-writing. But you have obviously the knots, and you have like colors of the various fibers. But what you also have is the textures of the fibers encode information. There's 2 different animal fibers. I can't remember what they are. I think one is maybe, I don't know, visually identical. Sorry?
No.
Yeah, visually identical. And in order to know which one was which, you had to physically touch it, because they had very different textures. And so you have a writing format, or proto-writing, whatever, that includes physical touch as a part of the encoding. I just thought that was incredibly cool. So yes, thank you so much for bringing that up. I will probably add them back into the talk, given that I now know that it runs under an hour. Right at the back.
I think there was one very obvious storage medium that was omitted,
Photography. Yeah, I guess, yeah, that's a really, really good point. I guess I was sort of thinking, and incorrectly, I was biased towards sort of binary data when I was thinking about it. So letting light in to expose photosensitive film. Yeah, I should absolutely add that in next time. Thank you very much.
Well, some people working on bootstrappable data storage formats for archiving. So the idea would be that if in the future you discovered the format, it would also contain instructions on how to bootstrap your way
Into, yeah.
to be able to read it. There's some. That's why I remember reading an article in Wired about this dude who was trying to basically preserve knowledge by having a bootstrap bootstrappable format. So that
I mean, that would be super cool. I should go away and try and find something about that. The thing is bootstrappable data formats, so that if you know anything about the format, you can access some information about how to get into the rest of the system, essentially. Yeah. I mean, I think I could suspect that that's the way that they're trying and head with the 5D optical data storage, because physically it's so durable that you could imagine it outliving the knowledge of the encoding. Let me turn that back on. One thing that reminds me of is, just cycling back in my memory, data that we've encoded for non-humans, which we've done a couple of times to my knowledge. And one is that the Hoover Dam, which is visible from space, it has a star map on it that encodes the date, like the galactically, date of when it was constructed. And the idea is that, if one day, humans are all dead and aliens come and they go like, what is this? This is clearly intentionally constructed. They can know when it was on a galactic time frame because of this star map. And the other is, I think it's called the Golden Plate, and we sent it out. Yeah, we sent it out with Voyager, and it's got things like, I think it's got some prime numbers on it to demonstrate that it was created by an intelligent people. We've got sort of anatomical depictions of humans and some language stuff, and lots of really, really cool stuff. It's like this sort of, almost like a time capsule, but across, like, intended for people that we have absolutely no idea how they would interpret this information. When I was starting to write this talk, I went down a whole thing of like, what counts as data and what counts as language? And there's encodings where we take information and turn them into objects, but there's also the encoding that happens between the idea that's in my head and the language that comes out. Because you ever have a thought that you really can't word? Like, any time that you have a thought and you turn it into language, it gets a little bit garbled. And I love that we've had this thing where we've tried to encode data for people whose that encoding from what's in their heads to what is a sort of objective physical reality, that we have absolutely no idea. Like, that encoding is fundamentally unknowable for each individual person in this room, but we can kind of make approximations. But the people for whom we potentially intended the Voyager, the Golden Plate, we have no idea. And that's just really, really cool to me, like, philosophically. This is why I thought this talk was going to run over an hour, because originally I had, like, me just going on a really trippy rant about the nature of consciousness for, like, 15 minutes. So, maybe one day, maybe next night at NDC, I'll come back and do that one instead. But it's just, like, really, really cool stuff about, like, what, you've got this physical object, and what counts as data and what counts as information. I didn't include cave paintings because they're information, certainly, but they're not like you and one can look at the same thing and get something completely different out of it. We might not even agree on what the painting is of, in a way that's not true of, like, if there's a sentence that we both read, we can agree on what the words are in it, even if we have very different interpretations of them. And that's a difference in the encoding between the thing we can agree on and the ideas and emotions that it inspires in our heads. Really going off the deep end on the philosophical tangent right at the end. We have 2.5 more minutes if we have any more chat. Hello.
I just tried to Google to make sure, because I thought I remembered something called a place of honor problem.
Oh, this is not a place of honor. Yeah, you get booty shorts with that one. It's great.
I couldn't find anything about it, except from the original idea that the place of nuclear waste storage had some culturally, hopefully,
Yeah.
messages.
Yeah, so it's I know a little bit about this. Sites where we've stored nuclear waste that's going to be dangerous to life for unimaginably long time frames because of the half-lives of the radioactive materials. And they've tried to write a message that will be understandable to people without the technological or cultural context to understand exactly what it is. And it's like, this is not a place of honor, no great deeds were commemorated here, this is a place of great danger, the danger is to the body. Like, really cool, like, metal stuff. It's amazing. Go and look it up. This is not a place of honor is a thing to Google for that. But yeah, it's trying to store data with as wide a range of, as permissive, as flexible, as possible, an understanding of how people will interpret it in the future. I think that's really cool. Like, the intersection of, like, technology and anthropology is just, like, it's fascinating to me. So yeah, that's a really good example of that. Like, as we go careen into the philosophical deep end. Any more for any more? One more.
Lot of fun fact like the rest, but we didn't talk about solid state disks.
Oh, their flash memory, yeah. Yes, so I should have more explicitly called that out. Solid-state disks are flash memory. They usually have a much higher lifetime wear and tear limit than, for example, just a thumb drive, because people are going to want to read and write to them more. The read and write memory limits are on the order of like 100,000 cycles, so you don't need to worry about like your SSD dying anytime in the near future. But yes, absolutely, solid-state drives. I'm not an SSD person. I don't think I own one. But I know loads of people like them for you keep your OS on it, you keep your video games on it, so they load really quickly. Fortunately, those are all read operations, and they're not going to increase the write cycle lifetime wear. So, yes, thank you. I think we are now at an hour. Yeah, we are, because I started 1 minute earlier. Everybody go to the party. Go, 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 go. Thank you so much for coming. There are stickers here at the front. Come and get them. Yeah, it's been a blast.